Welcome to session 28 of the Simple course. In the first part of the session today, we will finish our review of the skills training workbook. In the second part, we will look at a special kind of hole in the sidewalk most of us fall into, the holes we fall into in our relationships. We will discuss ways of thinking about and repairing this kind of hole. To watch the introductory videos entitled Love Me for Who I Really Am and Ithaca Will Change Your Goals, please go to session 28 on the website itsimple2021.com. Next are our usual reminders directed mostly at people doing the course in a group setting. Please take a few moments to read these on your own. To watch this week's mindfulness practice video entitled Mindfulness Reset, please go to the website now. For people doing the YouTube course as part of a group, you can now pause for questions, comments, or feedback. At this point, we have one YouTube and 2 or 3 live and virtual simple sessions remaining. Session 29 will be structured. The 1 or 2 live sessions after that will be much more informal and unstructured. This is a good time to ask you to fill out the course survey and assessment tools. Please fill out the Simple Course Patient Survey. You can find it on the website or at the link provided. Please also fill out the PHQ-9 and the Hamilton Depression Scales that you find on the website so we can compare them with those you filled out at the beginning of the course. This helps us to objectively determine if the course was helpful. Your suggestions and feedback are critical so that we can continue to adapt the course to your needs. For people doing the live or virtual simple course in 2 weeks, in the last simple session, you'll have the opportunity to give us suggestions and feedback in person. Thank you. This is what the PHQ-9 and the HAM-D look like. You can download them from the website. Let's review what we're going to do today. In the first part of the session, we'll review the skills training workbook, pages 259 to 265. This is the last week for the skills training workbook. In the second part, we'll talk about relationship holes and how to repair them. We'll have our usual break and time for discussion. Please rate your homework now. In the first part of this session today, we will review pages 259 to 265 of the skills training workbook. This section is very brief. It is also the end of the workbook. This short chapter deals with 3 topics. 1, putting it all together. 2, daily practices for emotional health. And 3, the DBT diary card. The first topic on page 259 of the workbook is entitled Putting It All Together. It's not our fault if we struggle with mental health issues, but ultimately it's up to us, with whatever help the world can provide us with, to change. Improving our mental health is possible, but requires the right tools, skills, strategies, and above all, our commitment and hard work. The last remaining pages in the workbook encourage us to adopt a daily emotional health practice. 2, daily practices for emotional health, page 259 of the workbook. A practical way of committing and working hard on improving our mental health is to have a daily mental health practice. The workbook suggests 5 daily practices. 1, mindfulness. 2, deep relaxation. 3, self-observation. 4, affirmation. 5, committed action. It lists the sections of the workbook that describe each of these practices. The simple course suggests that we do a daily holes diary card, and when our numbers are high, use the appropriate tools to assess and remedy the issues so that we learn to get out of our holes. 3. The DBT diary card, page 262 of the workbook. Along with the tools and strategies, we'll need skills to deal with our holes. The DBT diary card reminds us of and helps us review all the skills we've learned in the 4 DBT modules. Review it once a week. And that brings us to the end of the workbook. In the second part of the session today, we're going to talk about relationship-related holes in the sidewalk and how we can repair these holes. As you know, relationships are one of the most important aspects of our lives. They are of critical importance in our well-being and mental health. Before we start exploring relationships, I want to mention my favorite longitudinal mental health study and some of its insights into relationships. Relationships, health, and happiness. The Harvard study of adult development began in 1938. It began tracking 724 participants. Some were Harvard students, deemed by their professors to be well-adjusted, while others were young men from working-class neighborhood. Each year, the study collected extensive information from the participants regarding their physical health, their relationships, their attitudes, their challenges, their habits, etc. The study studied these men until their death. It also began studying their partners and their children. Investigators have been mining the troves of information gathered, now using artificial intelligence. From this has come numerous books and countless academic articles. One of the most robust findings emerging from this study is that the one factor above all others that contributes to good physical health and overall happiness is good relationships. The hole in the sidewalk metaphor has been central in this course. Today we're talking about relationship holes and their repair. Is the work of repairing relationship holes different than that for other holes? Relationship holes are a special case of all the holes in the sidewalk we fall into. We use the same tools, skills, and strategies, but there are some special considerations when doing this work. We will explore them today. In previous sessions, we talked about personal holes and how personal wise mind can help us get out of those holes and eventually avoid them. Today, we're going to talk about interpersonal holes and how interpersonal wise mind can help us heal our relationships. I imagine that relationship repair involves using the tools we've already looked at to help us out of the dysregulated emotional mind and into rational and wise mind. Yes, we will use the same tools, skills, and strategies, but let me introduce a new concept and term, interpersonal wise mind, and describe what it means. A few weeks ago, we discussed internal family systems and wise mind remediation. We were talking about personal wise mind remediation, which is used in internal family parts work. A person's growth and healing involves their personal wise mind taking over leadership from their parts. Today, we will see how relationship repair, healing, and growth involves interpersonal wise mind, taking over leadership from the parts of the people in that relationship. Interpersonal means between people. Interpersonal wise mind, in contrast with personal wise mind, which is mindful of only one person's parts, seeks to see and understand the internal family parts of everyone involved in a relationship and how they interact. In session 29, we zoom out from personal and interpersonal wise mind and consider transpersonal wise mind, which is involved in the repair, healing, and growth, not of the individual or a group, but of the whole planet's fragmented parts. Transpersonal means beyond personal identity. Why are relationships so difficult? To begin to address that question, it's useful to think of content and process in conflicts between people. It's useful to think of any conversation or conflict between people as having two distinct aspects. One, the content, and two, the process. The content is the subject of the conversation or conflict. In couples, conversation topics that tend to be contentious include sex, money, relationships with families of origin, neatness, and division of labor. In other relationships, contentious subjects often include politics, religion, ideas, status. Content is the what of our interactions. The process is the manner in which people talk with each other. Are they agreeable or disagreeable? In or out of the window of tolerance? Empathic or unempathic? Cooperative or competitive? Transactional or care-based? Are they good or poor communicators and problem solvers? Are they assertive, passive, or aggressive? Do they trust one another? Process is the how of our interactions. When people fall into interpersonal holes, the common assumption is that the problem is with the content of the conversation. Most of the time, however, it is with the process. The interpersonal process between people is related to their personalities and all the factors that contribute to them. Anthony Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg were ideological opposites but great friends, often vacationing together with their families. They had very different ideas or disagreed on content, but had a respectful and affectionate process between them. Heated agreements and agreeable disagreements. People can have heated agreements in which they essentially agree with each other on almost all aspects of the content, while the process is antagonistic and outside the window of tolerance. The Marxist-Leninist parties of my youth, in which groups whose ideas overlapped 99%, were bitter enemies. People can also disagree profoundly on content, while the process remains very agreeable, cooperative, pleasant, and they remain in the window of tolerance, respect, like, are open to, and learn from each other. Learning to get out of interpersonal holes does not mean people have to agree on the content. It focuses on the process and remaining in the window of tolerance. In any relationship between people, each person has better or worse interpersonal process skills, which are related to their openness, empathy, agreeableness, and ability to stay in the window of emotional tolerance. Relationships are easier and more pleasant between people who have high interpersonal process skills. Another important concept to consider if we want to understand why relationships can be so difficult is that of care-based versus transactional relationships. Care-based versus transactional relationships. In a care-based relationship, what makes me happy is when you're happy and when I can make your life easier and you reciprocate. It's win-win. In a transactional relationship, what makes me happy is to get as much from you as possible. I care more about my needs and happiness than about yours. It's zero sum. In care-based relationships, there's more play within the window of tolerance. When issues arise, people in this type of relationship are more likely to deal with the issues, compromise, and resolve them. In transactional relationships, there is more competition and emotional mind. In conflictual situations, emotional mind arises more often, and there's less resolution of issues and repair of the relationship. Every relationship is somewhere on the care-based to transactional spectrum. This is closely related to where people in the relationship are on the attachment spectrum. People with secure attachment are more likely to have care-based relationships, be able to stay in the window of tolerance, play, have richer connections, and greater life satisfaction. Care-based versus transactional relationships also have to do with people's circle of concern or empathy. Am I concerned only with my well-being, that of my family, my community, etc.? One of the challenges in a relationship is for both people to stay in the window of emotional tolerance when dealing with difficult issues. So we have to consider content and process in interactions, and whether relationships are care-based and transactional. Are there other important factors to keep in mind if we want to understand why relationships can be so difficult? Yes, repetition compulsion is another important factor at play in relationships. We have already talked about it in this course, but let's quickly review it. Repetition compulsion. Unconsciously and powerfully, we are drawn to people who feel familiar to us and resemble significant figures from our past. We are not drawn to people who are good for us. If we grow up with healthy attachment, securely attached people will feel familiar. If we grew up with insecure attachment, insecurely attached people will feel familiar. This is why, as adults, we end up in relationships that are similar to one another and to those of our childhood. This is called repetition compulsion. In repetition compulsion, people repeat the emotionally dysregulated patterns of their past. Understanding this phenomenon is key to avoiding repeatedly getting into difficult relationship patterns. Happier relationships are more likely between partners with more secure types of attachment and good interpersonal skills. If you have insecure attachment, don't choose a partner with your heart. Choose them with your head. To summarize, the likelihood that there will be conflicts between two people depends on how well regulated each one of them is. What can you do if you find yourself in a difficult relationship? If you're in a difficult relationship, it seems to me that you have four options. The four options people in difficult relationships have. 1. Status quo. Continue relationship as is. 2. Leave. Leave the relationship. 3. Repair. Work at improving the relationship by developing better interpersonal regulation skills and wise mind. 4. The most popular, but most unrealistic option is wishing the other person would and pressuring them to change. Each option has advantages and disadvantages. Consider them carefully. Different part selves in a person may prefer different options. Trying to repair a difficult relationship can be a lot of work. How do you determine if you should do the hard work or simply leave? If you're in a difficult relationship, one of the things you might consider in your decision whether to stay and try repair or leave might be how likely it is for that relationship to change through repair and growth. Prognosis for relationship growth and repair. Relationship growth is a journey in which people in the relationship go from being led mostly by emotional mind or internal family system part selves to being led increasingly by interpersonal wise mind. Two emotionally mostly well-regulated people able to access wise mind and who have good interpersonal skills are most likely to make adaptive changes and grow in their relationship, followed by one well-regulated person able to access wise mind who has good interpersonal skills, and one dysregulated with poor interpersonal skills and difficulty accessing wise mind. Two dysregulated people at the action stage of relationship change and learning interpersonal skills and developing the ability to access wise mind. Two dysregulated people, but only one is at the action stage for learning interpersonal skills. And finally, two dysregulated people who are pre-contemplative to the need to learn interpersonal skills and who don't have access to wise mind. There are a number of other indicators suggesting relationship repair is possible. Indicators that relationship repair is possible. People in the relationship accepting they are part of the problem, meaning being at the contemplative or action stages of change, having access to wise mind, being committed to the relationship and willing to devote time to the work of repairing it, having some openness to being vulnerable, being psychologically minded. The relationship already has significant positive aspects. Being committed and increasingly able to stay in the window of emotional tolerance, having the capacity for empathy, being high on the traits of agreeableness and openness. Consider these indicators in you and the person with whom you want to work on relationship repair when assessing the likelihood that change, repair, and growth will happen. Another factor that's important in repairing a relationship is where each person places the blame or responsibility for the problems in the relationship. Where are they in the stages of change model that we talked about in session 2? Readiness for interpersonal repair. What stage of change is each person in the relationship at? If they are pre-contemplative, they think the problems are all the other person's fault. If they are contemplative, they feel I also bear some responsibility, but I might not yet have skills, tools, and strategies needed to change. If they're at the action stage, they believe I bear some responsibility and I am using tools, skills, and strategies to make needed changes. Which stage of change are you at in the relationship you want to change? What stage is the other person at? Let's briefly revisit the holes in the sidewalk or road metaphor as it applies to relationships. Attachment, interpersonal holes, and repair. In securely attached, care-based relationships, holes come up on the relationship road, but people use their communication skills, emotional regulation skills, wise mind, and mentalizing to repair the holes as soon as they come up so that the relationship road remains in good shape. In the spectrum of progressively less secure transactional relationships, people don't know how or are not able to make regular maintenance road repairs so that the damage accumulates and the state of the road steadily deteriorates until it seems beyond repair, and people either become resigned to traveling on a terrible road or decide to abandon it. Alternatively, they can learn how to repair the road. People often blame the other for the road damage, but everyone in the relationship contributes to it. Some people, however, may do far more damage to the road than others. Relationship road holes repair requires 1. An ability to stay in the window of emotional tolerance, 2. Owning one's role in the damage and responsibility for the repair, 3. Working towards a more care-based relationship instead of a contractual transactional one, 4. Mentalizing, 5. Communication skills, 6. Tools and skills, 7. Wise mind. If you're in a conflictual relationship, you might also consider the following. 1. In a conflict, how much is your response proportionate to the circumstances? 2. How much is due to the activation of your part selves? 3. How much is it related to attachment issues and trauma? 4. Consider that the more dysregulation, the more interpersonal time you spend outside the window of emotional tolerance. 5. And that when you are with the other person, your emotional dysregulation is highly contagious. 6. And also that interpersonal dysregulation causes damage to the relationship road. Are there patterns in interpersonal conflicts that are important for us to know about? If people in a relationship are able to stay in the window of tolerance, that is, in calm or alert, most of the time, that is likely to be a good relationship. The more often they are outside the window in their interactions, the more difficult the relationship tends to be. Knowing what we know about the states of activation, we can predict what the patterns of conflicts in relationships are likely to be. In any particular relationship, some of these patterns will be more common than others. Common dysfunctional relationship patterns. Two people who are dominantly in fight. Another pattern of relationship is that in which people are primarily in fawn and fight. Yet another pattern is that in which people are predominantly in fight and flight. Another common pattern is that in which people are predominantly in fight and freeze. There are other patterns, but these are the most common dysfunctional ones. There are, of course, secure relationships in which people spend most of their time in the window of tolerance. Is there a procedure or algorithm for relationship repair? There are actually two algorithms. Let's first look at why we need two. We need two algorithms because in a relationship, only one person might be committed to doing the work to change, whereas in other relationships, both people are committed. Change is possible in both cases, but each requires a different approach. Are you saying change or repair is possible even when only one person in the relationship is committed to it? Absolutely. And that's because relationships are systems. Any input into a system changes the whole system. But in this case, only one person is at the action stage of change. In a conflict, one person may go into their usual mode of activation, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, while the other tries to stay in rational and wise mind and the window of tolerance. This is the basis of nonviolent resistance movements. Jesus when he turned the other cheek. It's not easy to do. Change is easier and more likely if both people in the relationship are at the action stage. One of the things that makes this difficult is that when two people interact, they tend to synchronize in one state of activation in or out of the window of tolerance. And there are other challenges when only one person is committed to the repair work. People in a relationship develop mental models of each other. Emotional dysregulation affects these mental models. When one person is learning to stay in rational and wise mind, the other person's mental map of them doesn't immediately change, and they will assume that the person doing the work is actually playing games. If one person is more able to stay in rational and wise mind over the long term, the other person's mental models of them are more likely to change. This process is slow and can be triggering and frustrating because one person may be making a big effort to change, but may not be given any credit for the work. If the other person is pre-contemplative and thinks you're solely to blame for the problems, and you stop engaging them in the way you previously did, they may think it's an admission they were right and have won. That can trigger in you more hurt and feelings of being misunderstood. Can we start with the algorithm for the more difficult situation where only one person in the relationship is working towards repair? Yes, but before we do that, let's just review some general principles of relationship repair that apply in both cases. Relationship repair uses the same tools, skills, and strategies we have already discussed in the simple course. If you are the only one working at the action stage of change, you will have a lot of editing, splicing, and pasting work to do. You will have to foster wise mind. You will have to become good at staying in the window of emotional tolerance, no matter what the other person does that might trigger you. You may want to review coping with resistance and conflict skills on pages 244 to 252 of the skills training workbook. You may also want to consider if the relationship is worth the amount of work and effort that you will need to put into it. If you're not reasonably physically safe in a relationship, repair is impossible. Your number one priority, as long as you stay in the relationship, should be to stay physically safe. Okay, let's look at working on a relationship by yourself when the other person isn't ready to put in the work. The algorithm for when you're working on relationship repair by yourself has 13 steps. Steps 1 to 6 when working on relationship repair by yourself. 1. Use relationship issues or conflict as the target on your host diary card. 2. Do a wise mind chain analysis when your diary card numbers are high. 3. Determine which of your internal family parts were activated by the situation. If you can, do the same for the other person. 4. Determine the dominant states of activation you and the other person were in: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Determine what your dominant parts felt, thought, and did or wanted to do. If you can, do the same for the other person. 5. Allow wise mind to understand, interact, dialogue with, and soothe each of your parts. 6. Ask what wise mind would feel, think, and do if it understood both yours and the other person's parts and it was leading the self system. Use the edit, splice, and paste technique to imagine the situation unfolding with wise mind leading the family system. Steps 7 to 12 when working on relationship repair by yourself. 7. Imagine the other person resisting and escalating. 8. Despite this resistance and escalation, imagine your wise mind staying in the lead of your system. Use coping with resistance and conflict skills. 9. Keep your personal dashboard in mind. Stay in the window of emotional tolerance. 10. Do not attempt to do this in a real situation until you have done it many times in your imagination. 11. Even if you don't do it in a real situation right away, the work you are doing in your imagination will start to affect the relationship. 12. As you do this work, keep exploring ways in which you or others can help the other person progress through the stages of change towards being more ready to change. 13. If you are not physically safe in the relationship, but for some reason can't leave, your number one priority is to do whatever it takes to stay physically safe. That may include avoiding triggering the other person. As for other holes we've worked on before, use videos of past conflicts to work on the algorithm. Remember to pendulate in order to stay in the window of tolerance. Do a wise mind chain analysis for the situation. Once you've done a wise mind chain analysis for yourself, try putting yourself in the other person's shoes and doing a wise mind chain analysis for them. Here's a summary of how to do relationship repair by yourself. Use relationship issues as a diary card target. When your diary card scores are high, do a wise mind chain analysis. This will help you to understand which of your parts are being activated. Consider what parts are activated in the other person as well. Starting from the wise mind chain analysis, do a wise mind remediation. Consider the dominant states of activation of yours and the other person's parts. Is your mutual activation in fight fight, fight freeze, fight fawn, fight flight, or another state of activation? Use the edit, splice, paste technique and practice the new video in your imagination. Can you give us an example of solo relationship repair? Yes, you can find this example on page 316 of the manual. Sheila was a 42-year-old married mother of two children. Sheila had been best friends with Yvonne since they were 3 years old. As children, they had lived across the street from each other. From grades 1 to 12, they had attended the same schools and had been maids of honor at each other's weddings. Sheila worked at a cheese factory since she was 18 years old, had over the years been promoted in the company, and was now shift supervisor. 5 years previously, a position had become available at the factory, and she'd encouraged Yvonne to apply. It was a well-paying job with good benefits. Unfortunately, since they had started working together, Sheila found herself frequently activated in her interactions with Yvonne. She did her best to hide this, and Yvonne seemed unaware of the issue. Sheila, who was taking part in the simple course, made these problematic interactions with Yvonne an interpersonal target in her whole diary card. The most recent incident that had activated Sheila had involved a man Yvonne had met online and started dating. Bill was handsome, smooth, a businessman who frequented fancy restaurants and drove an expensive convertible. Yvonne was over the moon and started investing in one of Bill's ventures. To do this, Yvonne had borrowed $10,000 by remortgaging the semi-detached house that she had bought out from her ex after the divorce. She had also started encouraging other employees at the factory to invest, and they had attended a seminar that Bill had given, and many of them had put between $1,000 and $5,000 into the company. Sheila was afraid this would turn out to be one of the train wrecks that seemed to be the story of Yvonne's life. But, as she had always done, listened quietly to her friend, delighted in her happiness, and was supportive. When Bill suddenly disappeared and could not be reached, Yvonne was beside herself. She made a missing persons report to the police, but a few days later received a call from a detective who told her that she was almost certainly the victim of a scam. Yvonne was devastated and became depressed. She stopped working, wasn't taking care of herself, or paying her bills. As she had done so often before, Sheila stepped up to help her friend and discovered Yvonne's finances were a mess. From the time she was a child, Yvonne had had a hard life and seemed helpless. Sheila felt horrible for all of Yvonne's misfortunes and felt it was her duty to protect her friend, who had no one else she could turn to. Sheila started to realize that Yvonne getting into trouble, becoming depressed, and needing rescue was a pattern. She used to think that it was just bad luck, but had come to believe that Yvonne was somehow self-sabotaging. At first, she thought this was deliberate, but as she learned about the unconscious, she became convinced that Yvonne was unaware why she repeatedly ended up in the same circumstances and felt she had a target on her back. It made sense for Sheila to see this as a hole that Yvonne kept falling into and for which she was pre-contemplative. She also realized by rescuing her friend, she was enabling the pattern to continue. This was also her hole. Sheila started working on a wise mind chain analysis and remediation for the Bill incident. Sheila realized that the fawning part of her had been activated. She could not say no to people, especially Yvonne. She had a mature adult part that knew that being in the role of a rescuer was not helpful. Sheila's inner critic, however, stepped in and overruled the mature adult, saying, "How could you be so selfish? How could you deny your best friend when she's in need?" Yvonne suffered from anxiety and depression. She would not be able to step up things would get even worse, and knows what would happen then. Sheila could not bear the thought. She agonized as her internal parts argued with each other. From a young age, Sheila had been the grown-up in her family as her immature parents constantly bickered. She consoled her two younger siblings and made sure they were looked after. She realized she was reenacting this pattern with Yvonne. Yvonne had poor boundaries and a defective trust meter. She longed for someone to protect her and jumped in with both feet if someone signaled they would. But it all fell apart. She would become blended with her helpless, despairing, abandoned child in flight and freeze activation. At those times, Sheila became Yvonne's exile, fawning protector. Sheila recognized that Yvonne was only going to change if she learned how her mind worked and started working on her holes. If her fawning compulsive caretaker continued to rescue Yvonne, they would both keep falling into holes together, and she would be contributing to her friend continuing to repeat this pattern. By rescuing Yvonne, Sheila was enabling her to continue in her current pattern by sheltering her from the consequences of her behavior. Consequences are how the world gives us feedback, and negative consequences are powerful motivators to do things differently. If people have to deal with negative consequences of their personality patterns and are at the same time offered a way forward, they have an incentive to take it. Yvonne had an outer locus of control and learned helplessness, which Sheila was reinforcing by rescuing her. As Sheila stepped back, Yvonne had to begin gradually taking some control over her life and actions. People who expect the solutions to their problems to come from the outside may not feel they can take control over their lives and may escalate the pressure on others to rescue them by becoming more helpless or even suicidal. This is sometimes labeled manipulative behavior, implying that it is conscious and planned. Understanding the unconscious mind helps us to see that it is not. Vaughn had never been in psychotherapy and was not familiar with the concepts that Sheila had learned in the simple course, but she was curious and often asked Sheila about it. She was confident her friend would, with a little encouragement, take the course. In the interim, Sheila would use the Bill incident to practice wise mind remediation. Rescuing Yvonne was not all or nothing. There would be a transition as she worked with her compulsive caretaker and inner critic, soothing them, encouraging them to step back as wise mind took over leadership in her relationship with Yvonne. She saw how Yvonne would only grow if they stopped reenacting their unconscious patterns. Sheila had to stop enabling or being codependent with Yvonne. Yvonne's parts would resist this, perhaps becoming even more helpless, and Sheila had to do the work on her own and learn boundaries. It would be short and medium-term pain for long-term gain. How is working on the relationship when two people are committed to the work different from doing it alone? There are 14 steps in the algorithm for working together on the relationship. Let's present the first 6 now, and we'll do the remainder later. Steps 1 to 6 when working together on the relationship. 1. Both people use relationship issues or conflicts as their whole-die regard targets. 2. When there's a high score, each person does their own wise mind chain analysis and wise mind remediations. 3. They each determine what their dominant parts felt, thought, and did, or wanted to do, and their dominant state of activation. 4. They allow wise mind to understand, interact, dialogue with, and soothe each of their dominant parts. 5. They ask what wise mind would feel, think, and do if it understood theirs and the other person's parts, and it was leading the self system. Using the edit, splice, and paste technique, they imagine the situation unfolding with wise mind leading the system. 6. They practice this repeatedly in their imagination. People do a wise mind chain analysis for the situation that triggered them. Then try doing an interpersonal chain analysis in which you put yourself in the other person's shoes and wonder what their internal family system's parts were that became activated in the situation. After doing these first 6 steps, if you are ready to practice together, you need to keep a few things in mind. Use the graduated exposure approach. Keep your personal dashboard in mind. If you go out of the window of tolerance, take a break to re-regulate. Follow all the steps. Don't go off on tangents. A referee to keep the rules might help. Steps 1 to 6 of the algorithm are done individually. Steps 7 to 14 are done together with the other person that was involved in the situation that was triggering. Step 7. After practicing steps 1 to 6 individually, repeatedly until each person has mastered them, together choose an incident from the ones you've worked on that you both agree was least problematic and therefore easier to work with. 8. Pick a time to get together and work on this incident when both of your gas tanks are as full as possible and you are both in the window of tolerance. 9. Have a crisis plan ready in case you fall into a hole. Use stop, pause, or a timeout. Share a crisis plan with the other person before doing this work. 10. Have a wise mind assertiveness script, dear man give fast, about the situation you chose to focus on, ready and share it with the other person. This script communicates your wise mind remediation. 11. While you do your assertiveness script, the other person listens without interrupting and withholding nonverbal language. Once you are finished, the other person summarizes in a validating way the essence of what they heard you say, without introducing their perspective or correcting what they think are your misperceptions. 12. Both people are paying attention to make sure they stay in the window of tolerance. They each have a crisis plan ready. 13. The two people switch roles, according themselves equal amounts of time. 14. It can be helpful to do this with a coach that reminds people of the rules. The structure of this work is important, but so is the process. People have to strive to cooperate, not compete. The main goal of doing this algorithm is to learn to communicate effectively and assertively. Communicating effectively and assertively requires that people stay in the window of tolerance and feel safe and heard. If this happens, they may have a secure experience which feels good. Can you give us an example of two people working together to repair a relationship? You can find this example of two people working together to repair an interpersonal hole on page 320 of the manual. Chris was a 35-year-old married sous chef who worked in a restaurant alongside his head chef wife, Kim. Chris was doing the simple course and had identified an interpersonal hole he fell into with Kim quite frequently. The most recent instance of this hole had occurred when Kim had asked Chris to cancel a wine order because the restaurant had excess stock. This was something that usually fell to the restaurant manager, who that week was off on vacation. Chris had completely forgotten, and a few days later the wine was delivered. The staff had scrambled to find a place to properly store it. The delivery had come as they were preparing for a busy night, and Kim had snapped to Chris in front of everyone. "I thought I told you to cancel the wine order." Although Chris and Kim fell into interpersonal holes, Kim was supportive and interested in what Chris was doing in therapy. She often asked him about what he was learning and read the simple manual sessions that Chris was working on. Both she and Chris agreed that they fell into interpersonal holes, which were quite painful for both as their after effects lingered for days and caused tension between them at work and at home. Chris and Kim agreed that they would use the wine delivery incident to do mutual repair work. Chris and Kim started working on separate wise mind chain analysis and remediations. When Kim was not sure about how to do something, she would consult with Chris. They were happy to be working on their issues together. When Kim had snapped at him, Chris felt hurt. This was partly well regulated, but Chris's hurt child and inner critic had also been activated. Chris's critic asked, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you do anything right? Why are you such a disappointing screw up?" And told him, "You're going to fail because you're a fake and only made it this far by riding on Kim's coattails." Chris felt that he had been caught making a terrible mistake and there was no escape. He was in between hyper and hypofreeze. In these states, he had trouble concentrating and was not his usual efficient self in the kitchen. Other staff had to step up to compensate. This made Kim angry, as she felt Chris was doing this on purpose to get back at her. She thought he was stonewalling her or being passive aggressive. Chris realized this reaction was dysregulated. When Kim snapped, his inner child had been activated. He felt transported back to childhood and his interactions with his demanding and angry father. Chris's attachment adaptation had been to internalize his father's angry criticism as his inner critic. This inner critic was the internal working model of what Chris's world was like and protected him by making him more compliant with his father's demands, thereby helping him to avoid an escalation of his father's anger and displeasure. Chris's father had extraordinary expectations of his son. He had to be a top athlete, scholar, and a son who unconditionally admired and loved him. When Chris fell short of these standards, he was chastised and ridiculed and emotionally abused. His father saw him as a disappointment and failure, and Chris's inner critic came to see Chris in that way too. If he was a failure, he wasn't acceptable and would be cast out of the family and be doomed. His father's anger was terrifying, and Chris, being a child, was unable to escape his family and resorted to leaving mentally, dissociating, or freezing. Chris realized that in his interpersonal holes with Kim, his dominant activation state was freeze. Chris's wise mind knew that Kim had some anger issues. Kim had realized that her anger was dysregulated and often apologized to Chris. When Kim's external critic was activated, she saw Chris as an incompetent failure. While in the rational mind world, Chris and Kim were in present day reality. In their emotional world, they were replaying conflicts from their families of origin. Kim really did love Chris and wanted to make things better between them. Chris knew that repair of his relationship with Kim was possible and that it would help to heal his internal family. When they fell into holes, they did not endanger each other. Part of Chris was terrifying of doing an assertiveness script for the wine incident, even if at first this was only in his imagination, with no definite time frame when he would have to share it with Kim. He knew that for his parts, sharing this with Kim was the same as confronting his father. He would have to do internal imaginal work to soothe his parts before he was ready to do an assertiveness script with Kim. As Chris worked on his wise mind chain analysis and remediation, he visualized the wine incident, but instead of seeing just him and Kim, he pictured, from his wise mind perspective, the interaction of their parts: his frozen, petrified child, his internal critic, and Kim's external critic. He was also aware that their wise minds had a common goal. He repeatedly replayed the situation in his imagination. He became better at not being blended with the frozen, petrified child, and from wise mind began to be able to comfort it. Eventually, he was able to visualize the whole situation from wise mind while staying in the window of tolerance. Kim had been doing the same work on her own. Eventually, they agreed they were ready to share their assertiveness scripts with each other. Chris did his first. They were both familiar with the wine ordering incident. Instead of expressing his feelings and thoughts, Chris described the parts of him that had been activated: his petrified child and his inner critic. His petrified child did not have any coherent thoughts. His inner critic thought he was a failure and would be abandoned. Chris asserted that he would like in the future would be to remain in wise mind and in the window of emotional tolerance. Kim was touched by Chris's openness and vulnerability, and they both shed a few tears. She had come to a similar understanding of what had happened. She recognized her dysregulated external critic and how it looked negatively upon Chris. Her mature adult and wise mind, however, saw a kind, considerate, hardworking, and lovable Chris. Kim's goal was to understand and soothe her outer critic so that it would not lead the interactions with Chris. The wine incident was not the last time Kim and Chris fell into an interpersonal hole, but each subsequent time, the work was easier. On the PowerPoint presentation that you will find on the website, there is a review and practice component that covers the tools, techniques, and strategies that we have previously covered in the simple course. Looking over those slides will help you consolidate the material. Let's look at the homework for this session. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and see you at the next session.